On today's Coast to Canopy, host Rob Diaz de Villegas sits down with 3 experts on hydrology and springs. They discuss the basic science about aquifers, the hydrology of springs, ongoing research, and more.
In 2026, Floridians experienced a once-in-a-lifetime drought. One of the most visible effects of this drought was in waterways tied to our aquifer. Springs, sinkhole lakes, and even portions of rivers dried down. Today's conversation is a combination of 2 interviews with people who work with springs in different parts of North Florida, where some water bodies have been more affected by drought than others. We'll talk about how water moves in the aquifer, how this is affected by the way we use water, and the potential effects of data centers. This is Coast to Canopy, an ecology podcast from WFSU Public Media. I'm your host, Rob Diaz de Villegas. We're here with Ming Yi, the professor of hydrology at the Florida State University Department of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Science and the Department of Scientific Computing. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we're also here with Kelly Keys, who for the last 2 years has been communications director at the FSU Wakulla Springs Lab. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so I want to start with you, Kelly. So you take a lot of people, you do a Wakulla Springs tour, which I've been talking, in my job, I talk to a lot of people who do ecological things, and I've been hearing more and more people talk about them going on your tour, and they seem to love it. And so talk about, when you take people down there and you see and you show off what is special about it. What makes Wakulla Spring an exceptional spring compared to other springs?
Well, part of it really is that it's an exceptional spring in an exceptional place. So we live, I like to tell people, in the land of 1,000 springs. There's over 1,100 springs in North and Central Florida. And Wakulla Springs, when we say springs, there's multiple springs that contribute to the river, but Wakulla Springs singular is the largest of them. And it is one of over 30 of the biggest springs in the state. Wakulla Springs is exceptional in many ways because it has one of the longest and deepest mapped underwater cave systems in the entire world that feeds that spring. And it's very close to the Gulf, which is also an interesting feature of it. I kind of call it the crown jewel. I'm biased, obviously, in this land of springs that we live in.
Now we head west in the land of 1,000 springs with Haley Moody, director of the Florida Springs Institute. In your bio on the Florida Springs Institute website, it says the Ichetucknee is your favorite spring. Mm-hmm. So I want to start with the Ichetucknee. I want you to describe it, why it's your favorite, and then I want to kind of zoom out and put it in the context of what you call the Springs Heartland.
Sure. Yeah. So Ichetucknee is an incredible system. It is 17 minutes from where I work, so I'm able to get there relatively quickly. It's an incredible system. I really can't say enough about Ichetucknee. It's where I first fell in love with the springs. And I think that's partially because of how the system is managed. Sam Cole is a park biologist there. He's been there a long time, and he takes such good care of that place. He's a specialist in plants. So the submerged aquatic vegetation is it's incredible there. But also, Ichetucknee is sort of unique in the fact that it actually has an established carrying capacity. So this is a science-based carrying capacity. It's based on a study that was done in the 70s at the University of Florida. And they placed a limit on basically how many people this system can sustain. So a lot of the springs that you'll show up to, you may get turned away because they're at capacity, but that's really based on the parking lot size, how many people they can fit in the parking lot. Whereas Ichetucknee, there was actually a lot of thought and care put into how many people can be on that system.
Right, and that's a state park, so I know I've gone there a lot for kayaking and tubing, right? So that's what we're talking about is how many people are actively using that, and also a swimming area, right?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
It's incredibly beautiful. The submerged aquatic vegetation is lush and amazing. And the Ichetucknee River has another unique aspect of it is that the entire river is not within a state park. So there is some portion of the lower river that is outside that park boundary. So as you cross over from the protected area into the unprotected area, there is just a stark contrast from what you see. The vegetation really changes. A lot of the vegetation, honestly, disappears because of the types of activities that are allowed in the lower river. So it's just a great example of what can happen with a state park when conservation is prioritized and the system's health is really prioritized. I love Ichetucknee for that reason. And we're actually studying the Ichetucknee this year. So we have a full year-long study. We're about halfway through it right now. So our science interns are getting to go out there and learn about the system too, which is awesome.
I go there, I camp there a lot, and also around the Santa Fe, Swanee River. And so what I always find kind of remarkable, every time I drive there, I always see a sign for another different spring that's not too far away.
Yeah.
I know you guys are based at High Springs, and it seems like there are just a large density of springs there. So talk about sort of, this is the Springs heartland of Florida, right?
That's right. So Florida Springs Heartland, that's the sort of nickname that the town of High Springs has. And it's due to our proximity to a large concentration of these first magnitude springs. So the springs that are producing more than 65 million gallons per day. So very large springs. And we've got quite a few of them up near us. So some people say the largest concentration in the whole world.
And so the Ichetucknee flows into the Santa Fe into the Swanee.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I read that the Swanee watershed has about 300 springs just around it, feeding into it. So talk about that and talk about what feeds those springs, like what land area feeds those springs.
So it's really interesting when you look at these rivers on a map. We have a Florida Springs map where all of the 1,000+ springs are mapped, and these two rivers really stand out on that map. It almost looks like they make a figure. It almost looks like a dancer, because there are so many springs lining these rivers that it just shows up as these little dots of blue all along the rivers. There is a reason for that. The Swanee and the Santa Fe are largely in an unconfined portion of the aquifer. So the water from these springs that's discharging out of these springs is coming from underground. It's coming from the Floridan aquifer. So rainfall, falls on the land surface. It percolates down through our sandy soils and eventually ends up recharging or refilling this aquifer. And then when that groundwater is under pressure, so you can think about it as like if you were trying to fill up a cup that was already full, it would spill out over the top. It's got to have somewhere to go. So that's what's happening with these springs. When that groundwater is under pressure, it ends up discharging out of an opening in the lime rock. And that's what we have here. We're in an unconfined area, which means that there is no barrier. There is no clay layer underground between the land surface and our groundwater. It's pretty much a direct shot from the surface, percolating down through the soils into our groundwater. That just makes a very springs-rich area. And that's what we find here, which is incredible. But because there is no confinement, because there is no clay layer down there, it also makes it very susceptible to pollution. So any pollutants that are applied at the land surface, they also have a direct shot into that groundwater.
And now a question for Ming-Yi. When we talk about the aquifer, I think a lot of times the way it's explained, it almost sounds like it's a giant cave of water, but it's not all open space like that. Can we get just a really brief, broad overview? Like when we talk about the Floridan aquifer, what are we talking about?
Yeah, essentially we are talking about limestone, and most of Florida is on the limestone rocks, and then limestone dissolved and formed the cave system, and the limestone itself is very porous. So essentially we're talking about a rocks, and you can imagine a large chunk of rock with conduit, with a porous in it, and then the water flows.
And so Wakulla Springs has a spring shed, which is the area that recharges it where water falls, and if it gets down into the aquifer, it is likely to come out of the spring. In our area, there are a lot of water bodies we've had an exceptional drought over the last few months, and a lot of these water bodies are kind of dried down. We have a lot of sinkhole lakes, and we see them, Lake Jackson, Lake Miccosukee, they're dried down. And these are part of the spring shed. And we know that when they're dried down, that this means that the upper aquifer is sort of lower. But Wakulla Springs doesn't seem to be as affected as other springs in Florida during this drought. So talk about why that might be.
Yeah, this is a spring. Every spring has you mentioned the spring shed. It's a concept we borrow from a watershed, but it's for subsurface. Several areas they call groundwater basin, but I think it would be better called spring shed because it has a strong interaction with surface water. So you have to study the spring and the surface water, and also meteorology water. And so this spring is very special, and Kelly mentioned it has the longest conduit system. That means it's a really large spring shed and has resources and water come from not just local, but even from Georgia. So that make this spring recharge area is very special. And also it discharges to the river. So it's a direct connection between groundwater and surface water. And that water flow into the Gulf. And also there may be connected with other caves that like Spring Creek Cave that connected to the Gulf. So yeah, it's a very special spring shed.
And just to add to that too, since I know a lot of listeners are in the Tallahassee area, and part of what I talk about on the tours is that a lot of people, they might have learned the concept of a watershed in school, but this idea of when raindrops fall, where if they're falling in your yard right outside your house, where are those headed eventually? And that is also related in our region to this concept of a spring shed, because in a lot of areas, there's not so many springs. And so most of Tallahassee, and like Ming said, into South Georgia, that is the spring shed, meaning when the rainwater falls and goes somewhere, that water in this entire region of Tallahassee is headed towards Wakulla, towards the springs. And so people sometimes don't realize how intimate their connection is when they're walking around in the concrete in the city, that water, those water drops are actually many of them can end up emerging at the springs.
Yeah, and then your tour as well, it's interesting. You talk about spring shed and watershed, but it's also kind of a watershed tour for a little bit of it because we're talking about the Munson Slough system. So talk about, you have a lot of water collecting into a system that also then just goes into the aquifer, and talk about, that aspect of it.
Yeah, well, when we talk about these caves, the underwater caves that are literally the pipe system for the spring, that's hard to visualize for most of us, right? Fair enough. And so it helps to start, if we start in Cascades Park, this very famous location in Tallahassee, and we can see the water that's on the surface and we watch it flow through the city, where in a lot of the southwestern side of the city, that water is all flowing to Lake Munson, familiar to a lot of us. If it's not, I encourage people to stop by and see it. It's a beautiful lake. And then it continues flowing southward, and it reaches a spot where it actually goes underground into the cave system. And there's not that many spots on Earth, really, that you can follow a creek that then disappears and you can't follow the creek anymore. And so it's this special thing here that we have these sinking creeks, but that really helps people visualize this idea that this water on the surface that we see starts to travel underground south of Tallahassee, and that kind of helps it click for people that, it's going into this cave system. That cave system travels to the springs.
Every spring has what's called a spring shed. So it's similar to a watershed. Most people are familiar with a sort of a river shed. It's the area of land around a spring that is contributing groundwater to that spring. And some of these areas are quite large. Some of these spring sheds are hundreds of miles across, much bigger than you would imagine. But if, a drop of rain falls within that spring shed, it has some chance of coming out of that spring. It's interesting. I was actually speaking to somebody who was responsible for delineating these spring sheds, and they sort of were kind of making a joke about it, that the entire state of Florida is one big spring shed. I mean, with 1,000+ springs, you could drop a pin anywhere and you're probably in a spring shed somewhere. But the Florida Department of Environmental Protection has delineated the spring sheds for our 30 outstanding Florida springs. Those span the state, and some of those are quite large because the springs are quite large.
I've interviewed people closer to Tallahassee here, and they do a lot of dye traces to figure out what's feeding Wakulla Spring or Wasissa Spring, which are springs kind of closer to here.
Yeah.
But when there's that many that close together, does that make it a lot harder to figure out, if there's a swallet somewhere, where would this water go? Or if I'm pumping, if there's a well here, can you pinpoint it really precisely, or is it a lot harder because springs are so close together? Or
Yeah, it can be challenging, for sure. And dye trace studies are a great way to do that. But that can also actually change over time, where the water is going, where the groundwater is going, and where it's discharging out of. That can actually shift and change depending on groundwater pumping, for example. So things are sort of shifty underground.
Yeah.
Maybe you wouldn't expect it to be, but there are springs that sort of pirate water from other springs. So, it depends, but dye trace studies are a great way to take a look at that.
So now I want to talk about in the last few months, we've been in an exceptional drought. It's interesting, closer to here, Wakulla Spring, if I looked at the gauge of the Wakulla River, it looks like more water is coming out of it. I've talked to people that, when less water is coming from Tallahassee, it kind of takes water, like you were saying, pirated. So it actually takes water and it seems to be flowing really strongly. But how's it working more on some of the springs closer to the Suwannee River? I know some of them seem kind of dry looking.
There are some less obvious ways that this is happening, and then there are some more obvious ways. Because there are 300 plus springs along the Suwannee, there is a significant portion of the flow is actually groundwater. So, historic flow rates have the springs contributing as much as 50% of the flow of the river. So when we're in a drought, it's really challenging because we have a reduction of the surface water flow, but then we also have the aquifer level dropping and a reduction in the groundwater contribution to that river. But we also have pretty significant industrial uses of water that are happening along the Suwannee. For example, one spring that I can think of, White Sulphur Spring up in White Springs. It's a spring at the turn of the century that was super popular. People were coming from all over the country to swim in the healing waters. There were all sorts of hotels and doctors' offices that popped up. But a phosphate mine went in, and in the 70s, it intermittently stopped flowing. And now it has stopped flowing altogether. But the phosphate mine is still in operation. It has changed hands, but, it's pretty clear why that spring went dry. So that's something we'd like to prevent if we can.
The flow at the beginning of the 20th century was something like 4.7 billion gallons per day out of the combined Springs Heartland springs, right? And then I guess today it's about less than half of that. 2.3, yeah, less than half of that. So you mentioned industrial uses. Is it just industrial uses? Is it agriculture? What's causing this? And also this has led partially to the river being designated as one of America's top 10 most endangered rivers, right?
That's right. Across the entire state of Florida, the U.S. Geological Survey estimates that the largest consumer of our groundwater is actually the public supply category. So we are using a little over 1 billion gallons a day just in the public supply. So that's anyone that's connected to a public or privately owned utility company, and that's a lot of people. That is the largest consumer is people's home use. And we have people moving to Florida all the time. It's a very popular state for good reason. It's incredible here. I can't say enough about our state. I'm over the moon for Florida for sure. But we have people moving here all the time. We have people visiting here quite a bit that also have a significant water use. That's the largest consumer. The second is agriculture. So that's at about 700 million gallons per day. And then behind that, we have commercial wells at about a little over 200 million gallons per day. So those would be like the phosphate mines or the bottled water, for example. So those are the largest consumers. I do like to focus on that public supply category because I do think, we all can make a difference. We're all involved in that, and there are certainly things that we can do in our own homes to save water. But there are some allocations that seem to be a little out of proportion. and it gets really challenging when we're in times of drought to really ask people to, do what they can to save water. I know in the Tampa Bay region, like restaurants had stopped serving cups of water to the people that were coming to patronize their restaurants. They had to actually ask for water. So those things are a little hard to swallow when so much water is being allocated for a single permit for an industry like phosphate mining.
Are there a lot of industrial permits issued in Florida? Because it seems like it's not like a huge amount of number, but that each individual user might use a lot.
So there are quite a few, and again, some will use more water than others. This particular phosphate mine up in White Springs, for example, is allocated over 60 million gallons per day, which is really significant. So I know bottled water gets a lot of attention, but across the state, I think it's all bottled water permits are somewhere around 6 million gallons per day. So that's quite a difference in terms of what people know about and what people are talking about and what people are really advocating for and against. I do think it's important that people have that information. They understand where this water is going.
So we, the consumers, are the ones using most of it right now. A lot of counties are considering whether or not they want to open up for having AI data centers, which are reputably known as taking a lot of water. What would that mean, having AI data centers taking water from the aquifer?
This is a hot topic right now. It is this sort of new industry. It is sort of this new thing being proposed in Florida. It has come pretty quickly, I think. But this is what I will say about data centers. A medium-sized data center could use as much as 300,000 gallons per day. A large-scale data center could use as much as 5 million gallons per day. There are different types of systems. There are open-loop and closed-loop systems. But they both have a direct water use and an indirect water use. And we just have to keep a careful eye on both of those, because the indirect water use from the electricity consumption can actually be quite large, even in those closed loop systems. This becomes really challenging when we see proposals for data centers show up within spring sheds of outstanding Florida springs, for example. There have been 30 outstanding Florida springs designated by the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act of 2016. And those springs actually have legal protections. What really needs to happen is that whether it comes before the county commission or whether it comes before the planning and zoning board or planning and development board, they both really need to be in very close communication with the water management district. Whatever water management district they're in, they need to make sure that they are requesting a water availability study before approving any sort of request for zoning change or approving a data center. They need to know from their water management district, how is this going to affect the water availability in our area? And if there is an outstanding Florida spring, how will it affect the minimum flow and level that's been established for that spring, or an outstanding Florida water, for that matter, that has a minimum flow and level? The counties and the planning and zoning boards, they really need to lean into the water management districts for that information, for the water modeling, because they're not gonna have that information. They're gonna need to get that from their districts. So that would be my recommendation moving forward.
And now back to the Wakulla Spring system. So you talked about the difficulty of mapping everything. So recently there was an announcement. I want to hear about this new initiative to continue mapping the system. I know we interviewed Chris Warner with the Woodville Karst Plain project last fall for Costa Canopy, and you're partnering with them. And then talk about, I guess, this new initiative and sunfish.
Yeah, so we were really excited. It was founded last year by legislature, and we start project in February. So we have mapped about 4.6 miles, and we're going to continue the work in the fall doing the mapping. So in the past, we really have really low contact with the spring. The only thing we do, like a dye tracing experiment, introduce a dye and see where it come out. But it's indirect. And we also use geochemical data, isotope data, all the tools we have, but they're all indirect. It's essentially you're like knocking around the wood and to see where the hole is, and geophysics too. But now we finally got a chance to go down into the cave. It has the sonar system, so we can map the size of the conduit and geometry of it. and can also measure nitrate concentration, for example, temperature and pressure. So we now have a really cool information or data that understand a lot about this conduit system. So we finally got a chance to, like, you imagine, we're not a doctor anymore. We are in the conduit. We are in the system, not outside the system.
Right. And so the Sunfish is a submersible.
Yeah, it's called autonomous underwater vehicle. Yeah, it's submersive and it can flow by itself and it's 6 dimensional, so you can just do a lot of things in the subsurface. And also, after it's been trained, it has intelligence and it can make decision where to go and more importantly, come back before
Right.
the battery is off. Yeah, so those information, we're still processing the data, and hopefully we're going to see a lot of things we cannot see before.
I know when we were talking with Chris last fall, I mean, we were talking about just what an undertaking it is to send human beings down there, how dangerous it is. I guess the idea is that the Sunfish can go in certain crevices that are maybe a little too small for a human being to go through. So talk about what that adds as far as what you can map.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things the Sunfish can do and without risking people's life. Probably you heard from Chris, they have to do the gas, they use helium gas, and so for under certain depths, probably 200 or 300 feet, they stay in the water for 1 minute. It's gonna take 4 minutes for them to get the helium out. So you cannot do much because you only have humans have limited amount of energy to work in the cave. And so with this robot, you don't need to worry about that as long as the battery is there and it can do the work. So it probably several times more efficient than us. This is in talking about the length of the work. And also it can go places that divers would not go. It may be just too dangerous or too dark, all kind of situation. And then they don't need to carry a gas tank, and they can carry sensors. So yeah, so new location, longer time, and more data. I'll say that way. Yeah, because the sensor mounted can do a continuous measurement, and just like a fish.
You can hear the rest of that conversation on the Coast to Canopy podcast, and you can check out the video version at wfsu.org/ecologyblog or on the WFSU Ecology YouTube channel.